Afternoon, everyone. Quick introduction. I'm Jonathon. I currently lead the security research group at BlackBerry. Moved into product security back in 2004. Prior to that, I was a software engineer. And this is Fraser.
Hi, yep. I'm a security researcher in the security research group at BlackBerry and used to work for encryption as a penetration tester.
So, in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about OAuth 2, giving an overview of the protocol, specifically focused on native apps, so how it's used on mobile. We're going to go through some of the authorization grants. These are the different ways that OAuth can be used. Then we're going to dive into three of the many areas that it can go wrong. So we're going to look at redirect URIs, embedded browsers, and CARF, or cross-application request forgeries. Then at the end, we're just going to rattle through a few of the other things that if you're implementing OAuth as on a mobile client or on a server, some of the things that you have to think of. Got some references at the end, just various bits that we've read in or whilst writing this presentation. So before we start, OAuth is an authorization protocol, so it's important that stick up the standard definitions of authentication and authorization. So just reading from the slide, authentication is the process or action verifying the identity of a user or a process, and authorization is the process or action of verifying that user or process is allowed to access a resource or allowed to perform an action. Normally, you need to be authenticated in order to be authorized, but with OAuth, things are a little bit different in that you can be authorized to do something, but you're not authenticated. And that's because you delegate authentication in the protocol. But we'll explain more on that later. So over to Fraser for an overview.
Yep. So what is OAuth 2? It's an authorization protocol. So it exists for one party to authorize another party to perform actions on their behalf. It consists of four main roles. So we've got the resource owner, which is us, the user, the authorization server and the resource server. And this is some service that provides a service to the resource owner. So in our examples, this is going to be a web-based email provider. And then we've got a client, which is the third party that we want to authorize to perform actions on our behalf. So because we're talking about native OAuth 2, this is going to be an application running on a device. So OAuth allows the resource owner to authorize the client to perform operations on their behalf at the resource server, and the authorization server is the mechanism that it uses to do this. So the resource owner has to have some existing account at the authorization server. So our example is webmail.com. It's the user signs into a web-based email provider and sends and receives email. The resource server provides some APIs on this account, which can be used for common operations. So we've got list mail, read mail, and send mail here. There's some form of implicit trust relationship between the resource server and the authorization server, and this is often achieved by them being on the same system. And then the client offers a service that uses these APIs. So our example is a mail robot, which is an app that logs into your email account and automatically sends and receives email for you. So the advantage of OAuth 2 is it allows the client to access the resource owner's resources without the resource owner having to reveal their credentials. So the example we've got at the bottom here, if you hand over your password, you're giving full access to the client to do whatever they like. If you give them an access token, which restricts them to only 3 actions, you've limited the scope of what they can do on your account. And the access token is used to do this. So the other advantage of an access token is it can be given an expiry. So the authorization server, when it hands it out, it's only valid for a week. So as soon as that's expired, the client doesn't have access anymore. But they can also be refreshed. So the client can come back to the authorization server after the access token's expired and request a new one. And as long as they're still authorized, they'll get a new access token. They can also be revoked. So the resource owner at any time can go to the authorization server and say, I don't want this client to access my account anymore. And then when they go and try and use their access token to use an API at the resource server can say no. So I've mentioned tokens. There's three main types. The primary one is the access token. This is created by the authorization server and issued to the client. It's used by the client to access APIs in the resource server. So this is used every time the client wants to access an API, it hands over its access token. There's multiple use. We've got refresh tokens, which are created by the auth server and issued to the client. And these are used when the access token's expired. They hand over their refresh token. The authorization server hands over a new access token. And this is single or multiple use. So you can either have one refresh token, which you use every time you want a new access token, or you refresh the refresh token. And lastly, we've got the authorization code. This is again created by the auth server, issued to the client, and is a very short-lived token which is just used for the client to exchange for an access token. So it should be a single use, and it's not always used, depending on which mode of operation of OAuth you're in. So the basic flow is called the authorization code grant. So because we're talking about native OAuth, the resource owner has an app on their phone. First thing they do is open the app and request to connect up to their webmail account. The client then invokes the operating system's browser using a URL like the one we've got up there. We'll go into more detail on the contents of this later, but the important part is it's handed over to the operating system's browser. And when the browser goes and fetches that URL, it gets a authentication prompt. So they sign in. And then we get the authorization prompt. And this is where you're granting the authorization to the client. So the scope that's been given here is access to the mailbox and sending email on their behalf. So, assuming that's successful, the user presses yes. The authorization server will send a redirect back to the browser to send it to a URL with the auth code embedded in the URL. This URL has already been claimed by the operating system, so the browser, when it receives this URL, invokes the app. The app receives the URL, pulls the authorization code out, and then it can make a direct connection to the authorization server and exchange that auth code for an access token and a refresh token. So now it's got an access token, it can make API calls to the resource server. Then some time passes. The access token expires, and it then uses its refresh token to go and get a new access token and a new refresh token option there. So this bit where the client exchanges its authorization code for its access and refresh tokens is optionally authenticated. And this gives rise to two different types of client. We've got public clients, which all native OAuth falls under. And in this case, there's no authentication. So the authorization server can't authenticate the client. And it's because the client can't store any secrets. Because if you embed a secret into an app and then distribute it to thousands of users, it's not secret anymore. The other type is confidential clients, and this is more when it's the client is a web application, so it's on a server. The server can store secrets, and the main advantage of this is it allows the authorization server to perform association between the codes that is handed out and the client. And the lack of this in public and therefore native is the cause of some of the issues we're going to be looking at later. The method of authentication is called client secret, and it's just a password which exists between the two of them, which is usually created at registration time. So when the app developers put in their app, they create a secret that only the two of them know. So now we're going to take a look at the authorization code grant in practice, and for the purposes of this talk, we've developed three demo applications. So we've got Secure Mail Robot, which is non-malicious, and it's been implemented using all of the mitigations we're going to talk about later. We've got Insecure Mail Robot, which is, again, it's non-malicious, but it's not taking into account any of the security mitigations. And then Bad Mail Robot, which is actively malicious and will be the source of a number of the attacks. So if I open up the Mail Robot app, the first thing you see is the option to pick your email provider. So if we go to webmail, at this point the client will redirect to the operating system's browser with a URL with some parameters in it, and these have been broken out here. This would be completely transparent, but we've got the client ID at the top there, which is the unique identifier that identifies this client. The redirect URI, which is a URI this app has claimed, and it wants its code to come back to. And then a couple of state parameters, which we'll go into more detail later. So if I press redirect to authorization server, it invokes the operating system's browser, and I can sign in. And then we're asked to authorize, so press yes. We're now handed back from the browser to the app, and you can see it's received its authorization code. I press exchange for access token. This is going to go off and make a direct connection to the authorization server and exchange that authorization code for an access token and a refresh token. Okay. And when I press save tokens, it's going to go away and use the access token it's got to call APIs on the resource server. And then we've got the app's got its access token, and it's signed into user@webmail.com's account and downloaded its mail. So now Jonathan's going to go into a bit more detail on some of these grants.
Okay, so the grants are the different ways that you can use OAuth. So far, we've just been talking about the authorization code grant. This is actually the only one that's been modified specifically for native apps to add some protection to the authorization code that we'll talk a little bit more. We will talk about more later. As well as that, there is the implicit grant, which doesn't protect the access token in the same way that the authorization code protects the authorization code. Both the implicit grant and the next one, which is the resource owner password credential grant, aren't actually defined for mobile, but we put them up for the purposes of explanation because you may run into them. The resource owner password credential grant, which is quite a mouthful, is actually built or provided as a sort of staging environment where if you're migrating an application from just using username and password to OAuth, you can start using this grant and initially, and then move it over to one of the other ones in time. Normal OAuth defines 4 different grants, but it's also possible to extend these or to change these. And OpenID Connect defines 2 or 3 other grant types, which are just different ways of getting access tokens or refresh tokens. So this is the authorization code grant, very similar to the, exactly the same as the one that Fraser just showed. So you have the authorization request here. They're going from the client app to the browser. You have the request being passed on to the authorization server here, the authorization and authentication part here, and then the return of the authorization code from the auth server to the browser and then to the client app. Then changing the client code for access tokens here, and then using the access token to access resources here. And then you have, after time has passed, you have the access to the refresh token being used to grab new access tokens. So moving on to the implicit grant, just to highlight the differences. So here, at the start, it follows a very similar flow to the authorization code grant. You have an authorization request that goes from the client app to the user's browser. Then that goes from the browser to the authorization server. Then the authentication and authorization steps happen. But in the implicit grant, rather than returning an authorization code, an access token is returned directly. This then gets to the user agent and is ultimately redirected back to the client app. Obviously, one of the differences here is there's no refresh token. So when the access token expires, the client app will have to go through the whole authorization step here again. This was originally written for JavaScript-based web apps, that don't have any way of persisting refresh tokens, but it's as the most simple of the grants. You may run into it sometimes in mobile. So the next one is the resource owner password credential grant. And here, the resource owner or the user just enters their credentials straight into the client app. And then the client will just pass those credentials and the requested scope straight to the authorization server. Obviously, this grant doesn't separate the credentials from the client. So the client has, as well as access to your credentials, full control over what access it requests to your account. When the authorization server gets those and validates the credentials, it'll then pass back an access token and a refresh token, and at that point, it's exactly the same as the authorization grant. So now we're going to move on to talk about the redirect URI and some of the vulnerabilities that exist in or with it, specifically on mobile. So when the client is making an authorization request, it sends a URL of the following form, as you can see on the top. Within the URL, we have the client ID, which is just a unique identifier for the client. And we also have the redirect URI. So this is the address that the client wants to receive the authorization code or the access code. There are two types on mobile. There are system URIs, which are any protocol, and then there are claimed URIs, which are either HTTP or HTTPS. So what happens when having passed the redirect URI to the authorization server, once the user's been authenticated and authorized, the authorization server will then pass back the auth code or the access token appended to the redirect URI in the form that you'll see here, and then that will pass from the authorization server back to the browser and then to the client, and then the client can use the authorization code or the access token as needed. So now I'm going to pass over to Fraser to talk a little bit more about the details of what the URIs look like.
So on Android, the client app registers its redirect URI in the Android manifest.xml file, and this is the data section here. So for a custom URI scheme on Android, you can use HTTP, HTTPS, or anything you like. So here we've picked OAuth as the scheme. We've got the rest of the components of the URL there. This is completely unverified. Any app can register whatever it likes. But the first time you go to visit one of these links, or the first time the browser tries to redirect into one, a prompt will pop up saying which app do you want to use to open this. So it'll say, do you want to use the operating system browser, or do you want to use whatever's installed that's registered it? For claimed URIs, this can only be HTTP or HTTPS. And the difference is it's got this auto verify equals true attribute in it. And basically this causes the operating system app install time to go off to this to the URL that you mentioned and try and verify that your app actually owns this URL. And the consequence of that is the browser has the operating system has more trust in it, so it doesn't have to do the app picker step, so it can automatically redirect into your app. On the server side, this is what this looks like. So it has to be a valid HTTPS URL with a valid certificate. And then you put a asset links.json in the well-known folder. And inside is the package name of the application and the SHA-256 of the certificate that was used to sign the application. And as long as this is all valid and the OS can see this, it'll let you automatically handle those URLs in your app. iOS offers pretty much exactly the same thing. Custom URL schemes, they're a bit more restricted in that you have to use a custom protocol. You can't claim HTTP or HTTPS. And this is done by embedding this in the info.plist file. This is completely unverified. When you go to browse to one of these on iOS, it'll pop up with a "Do you want to open this in this app?" prompt. There's no picker. And because there's no picker, it does attempt to try and have some state. So the last app that went into the browser will be the one it tries to come back from. There's also associated domains, and this is almost identical to Android. You have to be HTTP or HTTPS. It's verified at install time, and this is inside the project settings. Server side, again, very similar. Has to be valid HTTPS URL. In the Apple app site association file. In here, you register the bundle ID, the developer ID, and one difference on iOS is you can register paths as well, so you don't just claim the domain, you can claim the sub-paths under it. So now we're going to take a look at one of the vulnerabilities now.
So the reason that we went through all of the explanations is ultimately, if as a client, if you're using the incorrect type of URL, a malicious app on the same device can have already claimed the URL that your client that you want your authorization codes or access codes to be redirected to, and if you've already accepted that application, then a well-behaved application, a malicious application will be able to intercept the authorization codes or the access tokens for another app that's installed on your phone. Now, because the authorization code can then be swapped for access to your mail, it effectively means someone a malicious application can gain access to your resources. In terms of the different URLs, if you're using custom URIs, you're generally vulnerable to this because there's no way to claim ownership. In terms of claimed URIs, on Android, if you haven't proved or claimed ownership, you may be vulnerable as well. On iOS, it's not possible to use a claimed URI without proving ownership. So ultimately, you need to prove ownership, or ideally, you prove ownership to prevent this. But there are other ways which we will talk about now. In terms of what that looks like, so here we have a client app performing a standard authorization request to the browser, then a standard exchange between the browser and the authorization server here. But at this point, when the authorization code comes back to the user agent, it gets redirected to the attacker-controlled app, or in our case, bad mail robot, and then that application can exchange the code for some access tokens and then ship them off to an attacker-controlled server. And then once the attacker has your access tokens, he can use them, or they can use them to access resources on the resource server. And if they've got refresh tokens, they can persist access to your account for as long as the refresh tokens are valid. So over to Fraser to show you what that looks like in practice.
So in this example, we're going to go to Insecure Mail Robot, and when I choose the webmail, you notice here that we've got the client ID as Insecure Mail Robot, and then the redirect URI we're using is a custom one. It's based on OAuth 2 protocol, and then com Mail Robot Insecure. And this has also been registered by Bad Mail Robot. So when I go to redirect to the authorization server, same process again. So we're going to authorize as Insecure Mail Robot. If it gets passed off back to Bad Mail Robot, now it's got the authorization code. Exchange that for the access token. And then it's safe. It'll use the access token to go and log into user@webmail.com's email account. And so now we're going to look at how to mitigate this.
So within the when the client is making an authorization request in the OAuth 2.0 native RFC, they defined a new part of the protocol called the proof code exchange. And the idea is that this allows the authorization server to associate an authorization request with a token exchange. So what the client does is it generates a secret, then generates a hash of that secret, and sends that in the PKCE variable to the server. The code challenge method is just the hashing method that's used. So then that gets sent to the authorization server, and after the user has been authenticated and authorized, the authorization server will then keep that PKCE information and associated with the authorization code that it returns. When the client is then requesting an access token and a refresh token using the authorization code that it's been given, it then sends the secrets of the PKCE in the clear. At which point then the authorization server can look at the access code and the hash secret that it's been given, compute the hash secret and compare it to the one that's just been given by the client. And at that point, it's bound the authorization code that was issued to this client at request. And if they match, then it returns the authorization code to the client. So the idea here is if I, as a malicious app, get hold of your authorization code, I don't know the secret, therefore I can't supply the correct secret during token request, and therefore won't be able to convert an authorization code into an access token and a refresh token. So, just as a summary, on native apps, the clients must use PKCE, and the authorization server must require PKCE for public clients and perform the appropriate validation during the token request. For redirect URIs in general, the client must register a full URI with the authorization server. There's a previous talk that Fraser and I did on OAuth native for web, and we talk about that a lot more. But if you don't have a pre-registered URI, you have a similar problem. The authorization codes can be redirected anywhere. For implicit, things are much more constrained. So the only way to use the implicit grant correctly or securely is to use a claimed URI for the redirect URI and ensure that the client has proven ownership of that URI. Because again, otherwise, any other client will be able to register or claim the URI. And the same rules generally for implicit apply, in that it must register a full redirect URI with the authorization server. So moving on to the next vulnerability. This is using an embedded browser within your native app. So up till now, all of our examples have shown the client using the system browser. However, if you decide to use a web view, or a malicious app decides to use a web view, then the browser part and the client are part of the same process. So at that point, the client is able to interact with the web view, so access information that's passed and interact with all the pages. So it can steal your It can steal your credentials, and it can do things like automatically authorize you. So rather than you seeing the authorization dialog, it will just click on it automatically for you. In terms of what that looks like, so here we have bad mail robot. We have the client app part, and we have the web view, but they're both within the same process. So the client starts an authorization request, and that goes to the web view. The web view then requests the login page, and then the user enters their username and password here, and in the web view, they go to the authorization server, but also they get recorded by the client app. And then the authorization server returns the authorization page, but rather than being displayed to the user, it's automatically posted by the client app. And at that point, we just move into a standard authorization code flow. So Fraser's going to show you what that looks like in practice.
So in this example, our user has either been coerced into installing the Badmail Robot app, or they've installed it accidentally, and they're going to follow the standard flow. So the request to connect to webmail. And you notice these parameters are identical to the ones that were sent in the secure case. So it's spoofing the secure mail robot's client ID and redirect URI, and it's sending all valid state information. So valid PKCEs in there. When I go to redirect, you notice that doesn't go off to the OS browser. It stays inside the Badmail robot process. User signs in. We get a prompt there from the operating system, so the client's stolen it, and that authorization was automatically advanced without me doing anything. Again, send the auth code off to the authorization server with a valid PKCE. And we get access tokens and refresh tokens back. Save those, and now Badmail Robot is going to be associated up to the user at webmail.com's account and has access to their email. And again, we're going to look at mitigation with this now.
Okay, so the mitigation for this one is fairly straightforward. It's where possible, use the system browser. But because actually the root cause of this is malicious apps, you're unlikely this particular mitigation probably won't work. So you end up having to fall back on user education, so ensuring that they only install trusted apps. It may be possible to educate users as to the difference between a web view and a system browser, but it's quite subtle, so not really sure how that one would work. So now we're going to move on to cross-app request forgery. Very similar to cross-site request forgery, but this time working in the context of native apps. So the idea with cross-app request forgery is an attacker gets an authorization code from connecting to the authorization server. So the attacker logs in using their account, and then they capture the authorization code. And then they send the authorization code direct to the client using the redirect URI as shown here. So what this allows the attacker to do is to connect their session to their account on the client to the user session. So if you had already logged into Mail Robot and an attacker performed this attack on you, it would then switch the account that you were using from your account to the attacker's. The idea being, if with the Mail Robot, the attacker could then monitor maybe your usage of the APIs or the mail that you are sending. As per cross-site request forgery, there are different ways that you can perform this attack. So URL in a phishing email, URL in a web page, or if you have a malicious app on your mobile, it could just perform it as a direct IPC call. In terms of what that looks like, so your client app has already performed a full OAuth flow here. The attacker connects to the authorization server. They authenticate and authorize for their account. But rather than redeeming the code for tokens, they send that code to the client application. The client application then gets the code and goes, I've got a new authorization code, and swaps that for access tokens and refresh tokens, and then starts using the access token and the refresh token that belong to the attacker's account. And so Fraser's going to demo what that looks like.
So in this one, the attacker starts off by browsing to the web version of the webmail authentication and authorization prompts, and then signs in with their own credentials. Then they authorize access to their own account, and in response they get back an authorization code, which they can go and embed in their own website. So this URL here, it's redirecting back to Insecure Mail Robot with their auth code that they've just generated. So now, using some phishing method, or managed to get the victim to visit this website, and they click the link. This automatically invokes Insecure Mail Robot, which will automatically process the auth code and exchange it for an access token. And then once it's got that access token, it's going to automatically send that off and access the resource server's APIs. And because this is an access token that belongs to the attacker, we're actually signed into the attacker's account now. So we have access to their mailbox, but anything that we send is also going to go to their account. So if they were to go to the web version of webmail and log in, they'd see everything we were sending, or the victim was sending. Again, I'm going to look at the mitigation for this one.
So very much like the mitigation for cross-site request forgeries, the mitigation for cross-application request forgeries is a value that the client knows. So specifically the state parameter. So on the authorization request, the client now adds a state parameter, which is a random value to the redirect URI. This then goes from the client to the system browser and then onto the authorization server. And once the client has been authenticated and authorized, the authorization server returns the redirect URI, ensuring to append the state parameter that was previously provided to the redirect URI. This goes then back from the authorization server to the browser and to the client, and at that point the client can bind the authorization request to the authorization response. Bouncing back briefly, the other thing to note is the PKCE does indirectly prevent this attack as well, where the client sends the hash of the secret in the authorization request, because when the client then comes to redeem the authorization code, if the authorization code has been provided by the attacker, there is no way that the client will know the correct secret. So the redemption of the authorization code during the token request will fail. For the implicit grant, though, you are completely reliant on state. So just in summary, the client must include a state parameter in the redirect URI, and the authorization server must return that state parameter, and then the client must validate that they match. As I previously mentioned, PKCE will also prevent this on the authorization code grant. The other thing that a client can do to partially mitigate this is to not accept unsolicited authorization codes or access codes. While it won't mitigate it completely, it reduces the window, so it becomes then a race between the attacker and the user whenever they're performing an authorization request. So we've looked at three of the more tricky or complicated vulnerabilities within OAuth. There's actually a full threat model for OAuth on web, which is RFC 6819. Within there, the threat model has 50 different threats and countermeasures, and Section 5, which is the security considerations, has a lot of detailed countermeasures. The next RFC is 8252, which is OAuth 2 for native apps, and in there they add an additional 12 specific security considerations to think about for native. So the next couple of slides, just to give you an idea of some of the other things to think about with OAuth. So if you're using OAuth on Windows or Mac, they don't have the concept of claims URIs or system URIs, so you have to use the loopback device, and this is complicated. OAuth is actually an authorization protocol, although it's been co-opted to be turned into a user authentication protocol. If you're not very careful about about the binding between the access token and the client, it's quite easy to fake or to end up being authenticated as a different user. There's all the classic issues with authorization, such as asking for client asking for too much access, and some homograph attacks. There was one 2 or 3 years ago on Google that made the headlines. In terms of client credentials, as with anything that's a password, storage of them is a problem. Token generation. Obviously, the access tokens and refresh tokens and authorization tokens need to be sufficiently large and cryptographically strong, so they're not guessable. Also, they're stored. Now, they'll need to be stored potentially in the authorization server. Again, for things like the refresh tokens, these are equivalent to long-lived passwords, so you need to be mindful of that while storing them. In terms of transport, all the RFCs recommend to use TLS. Obviously, if you don't, you can have fun and steal them using a variety of network attacks. In terms of some of the mitigations, so if you're doing anything to do with Windows and Mac on native apps, it's best to read the RFC. There's a lot of complexities around the loopback device. User authentication, we covered this in detail in presentation at BSides Leads. You have to basically ensure the access token was issued to your client. On the authorization side of things, it's mostly just about providing a UI such that the user can manage everything, manage all of their authorizations, so notify users when new ones happen, etc., etc. Client credentials, we talked about, they should only be issued to web clients and not native. Token generation, it's standard stuff, strong PRNG, 128 bits or greater in length. In terms of storage, if you're using high entropy tokens, you can get away with just a single SHA-256 on them fine, rather than using a much larger, more complicated function like scrypt or bcrypt, because they've got a very high entropy. I'll skip the bit about token binding. So we talked a bit about some of the tokens, about how often they should be used, their time to live, and things like that. Again, all considerations that you need to think about if you're running an authorization server. The other thing that the threat model talks a lot about is monitoring. So there are various things that if you're running an authorization server that you could spot, such as an authorization code being used twice, or if particular bindings that you know should happen. So if an authorization code is used by a client that shouldn't have access to it, it means something has gone wrong. So all of these are you can monitor for, and they're indicators that there's some compromise or something strange is happening within your environment. In terms of a revocation strategy, this is basically if something goes wrong, how do you deal with it? So if an access token or a refresh token leak, what is your mechanism for dealing with that? If a client secret leaks, what is your mechanism for dealing with that? And finally, an obvious one, use TLS. There's a couple of pages of references. I'll leave them up there for a few seconds. We'll try and put the slides up, and I believe the videos will be up anyway. Yeah. And with the exception of one thing, so currently, just a very quick one, BlackBerry's currently hiring. So security researchers, security response engineers, program managers, developers. If you're interested, come find us. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, guys. It was really interesting. Do we have any questions? Yes, we do up at the top. Let me just comment. One day I'm going to fall up these stairs. You could have shouted it, but I've been told we've got to use the mic. Maybe because just want me like an idiot.
Just a quick question on the redirect URI attack. I didn't really get how the malicious application tampers with the legitimate application's redirect URI to change it to somewhere malicious. How does the redirect URI get tampered with?
It's more of a case of the malicious applications registered the good URI with the operating system. So if it was installed first, it registered that one before the good one did. So it gets redirected to that one.
Do we have any other questions? Superb, Alfie.
Hi. So for first-party applications who might not necessarily want to open up a web browser because they want to provide a better in-app experience for the user, what would you recommend for using for accessing Auth's resources?
There is now in iOS and Android, you can embed the operating system's browser within an application, which isn't something we covered because it's a bit more complicated, but it gets the same effect of having the browser in a different process, but you can still embed it within your application, so you don't have to break them out of the application. But the app, because it's in a different process, doesn't have that privilege over it.
As opposed to using client credentials where you just provide the username and password because it's the first-party app anyway, so it's less of an issue providing your credentials to that app, would you say?
It depends on your threat profile or your threat model. So, it depends.
Another question? Yeah.
You mentioned that some of the security depends on the user entering data into the the system browser. How is the user supposed to recognize the system browser from an actual malicious attempt to look like the system browser?
That's the tricky part. It's because it's user education. It's not an easy one to solve, and there probably is no technical solution to it.
In Android, they've got some stuff nowadays for showing trusted dialogues. So do you think there's a potential for have something like that would launch a browser in a way that the user is guaranteed to be able to recognize?
Again, it's a case of the user knowing that that's what they're interacting with.
Thanks.
So thank you. Do we have any more questions? Oh, down here, yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Mitigations. What other mitigations do you consider for the authorization server, which gives the tokens out? I mean, because obviously that's a potential attack. And also you talked about knowing behaviors which were unexpected. So what implementations have you got to sort of mitigate against that?
Second line. So all of the stuff at the end is basically a very high-level summary of the stuff that's in the threat model. The threat model will go through in detail what you need to validate before you hand out an authorization code. So in the instance of a web client, you should be authenticating the client before. You authenticate the client and you check that the authorization code was actually issued for that particular client. On the native side, it's about using PKCE. So you're always you only issue an authorization code to an authenticated user, and then when you're swapping when the client is redeeming the authorization code, depending on the scenario. So with web, you authenticate the client. With native, you authenticate that it was issued to the same app. All of the behaviors, so what to look for, are referenced in the threat model. One thing to note, on the implementations that I've looked at, none of the monitoring was actually there. So,
you're not telling us you should have a mapping that's expected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I've looked at a few internally, and they haven't had the monitoring that you would expect. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's about policy then in terms of what you decide to do in the instance of that happening. But they just didn't even have the hooks for that in there. So you're going to end up writing it yourself.
Superb. Any more questions? Okay.
So it might be linked to what you just mentioned there around some of the investigations you've done, but with UK banks now having to open up their services via API, and OAuth particularly being utilised for payment service providers, account service providers, have you happened to do any research and identify how well or otherwise all these providers are implementing their apps? No. Not as yet.
Not looked.
Superb. Any other questions? No, superb. So can we put our hands together for Jonathon and Fraser? Thank you very much.